This is an elective on the role that environmental pragmatism might play in a series of critical debates this year. I want to start by saying that this is ultimately an elective about what we treat as framework arguments in debate. Okay, that is, we're going to deal with relationships between ontology, epistemology, and ethics, largely in a discussion about the environment or ecological ethics. And these are the key words that debate uses to establish alternatives to plan-focused debate, right? When we're thinking about having a framework debate, what we're really discussing is what is it that we need to evaluate aside from purely the kind of consequences or effects of the plan? What are the other things that are involved in making our decisions? Should they be focused only on the plan? Okay. And I think that the real struggle that many affirmative teams face in explaining responses to these arguments that are substantive rather than theoretical or procedural is there's no sense of like what are the cards or kind of the arguments that we would make that make some of our framework arguments about something that is different than just it is unfair that people read critiques. Okay. And the like, it is unfair that people read critiques is an argument that it's not going to win a ton of debates right now. And so designing and kind of figuring out some of the alternatives to those more procedural notions about framework seems pretty important for a variety of AF debating. Okay, so the goal here is to provide a set of arguments about environmental pragmatism that provide some of those kind of substantive routes for debating something that otherwise is going to remain in the purely theoretical or procedural realm about what is or isn't fair for the AF and the neg to do. Okay. I'm going to use a couple of our generics to talk a little bit about like what do these framework arguments look like on the neg in order to understand some of what our AF responses might look like. But just first to kind of set the ground for these debates about environmental politics and ethics. There are a variety of approaches to green politics or environmental ethics. I want to give a brief summary and then talk a little bit about like some of the core concepts that show up. I'd say number one is who or what counts. Okay, so should environmental ethics or ethics in general be anthropocentric or human-centered? Is a core question that's found in these debates about environmental ethics. Non-anthropocentrists, okay, often provide different holistic accounts of what counts. That is, instead of thinking about it from the perspective of what counts is, is humanity or humans and individual humans, we think holistically about humans as embedded in a set of ecological processes or the biosphere, biocentric environmental ethics. Okay, so prominent alternatives to anthropocentrism include biocentrism or ecocentrism, different ways of defining what it is that ethics ought to value. Should it value humans in their individuality or as kind of parts of a larger holistic it could be some versions think of that as a larger holistic organism like the Gaia theory, but others think of it as because humans are interdependent upon other plants and animals that valuing the things that are about that interdependence or valuing interdependence in and of itself is the alternative to anthropocentrism. And a key goal of non-anthropocentric environmental ethics is a form of decision making that says that non-human entities have intrinsic value instead of instrumental value. That is, instead of treating the environment out there as something that is available largely for our use, that is, it's an instrument, right? It's like it's a tool that we use to achieve other ends. We turn the environment into stuff that we use, okay? Intrinsic value says that, those are things or organisms that are valuable in and of themselves, right? It is in the thing, not as a result of being turned into a tool or an instrument for our use. An example of this, right? You could say that biodiversity is important because biodiversity will be important for disease research, right? Or a healthy biosphere is important to maintain human life. Both of those are instrumental claims. Biodiversity is important for maintaining some form of anthropocentric value. Arguing that biological diversity is a good in and of itself because human life is one form of life among all others is an example of how you might make an intrinsic environmental ethical argument about biodiversity. Okay. So that's kind of one, who and what counts. Two, there are debates about pluralism versus monism. Okay. And this is a debate about whether or not we should develop a single ethical system whose principles guide decision making in any number of areas, okay? Or should we try and incorporate a variety of different principles and perspectives to make environmental politics or ethics more inclusive or flexible to respond to a variety of different circumstances, okay? Monists are oftentimes some of the strongest critics of anthropocentrism, but not all monist ethics are non-anthropocentric. Okay, so for example, utilitarianism is a monist ethical system because the concept of utility is the kind of common measure for all decision making, but it's a monist form of anthropocentrism. Okay. In a monist form of biocentrism, it is important that we value non-human entities because of their intrinsic value, right, rather than because of their instrumental value. And there are a variety of kind of like the land, Aldo Leopold's land ethic is a good example of something that's been defended as a monist, non-anthropocentric environmental ethic. Okay. I'm going to start kind of the example that I'll use to talk through this in terms of framework debates and some of the pragmatism responses. I'm going to talk through we produce generics for deep ecology and ecofeminism, right? And I'll go over a couple of the features of those arguments just in case people aren't super familiar. So, right, deep ecology is probably the most familiar ecocentric and monist argument in debate. So deep ecology argues that mainstream environmentalist shallow approaches treat environmental harms as incidental side effects of particular parts of our industrial growth-oriented economy. Okay. As a result, shallow environmentalists tend to argue for either greater precision in pricing environmental costs, right? So internalizing environmental externalities in the use of resources, right? So if you think about protection of natural resources, that's being done for reasons to kind of bring those either, say that they can't be priced successfully, so we need to regulate them, or, like the privatization CP that says, we can actually incorporate all of those via monetary values and price signals, right? Or, shallow ecological arguments from this perspective, right, argue that greater economic or technological process to reduce environmental harms, right, is the way to go about managing better our relationship to the environment. So the kind of notion of better management. Deep ecologists view environmental harms as a necessary outcome of modern industrialism, it's not incidental or accidental to the process. It is a core component of it. The production, according to them, of a kind of modern Enlightenment subject requires a strong separation between subject and object. So, like, part of the reason for the utilitarianism as a philosophy of the Enlightenment, that that notion of utility, what produces human happiness, that's then about a human subject. Like, is this thing valuable for me? Does it make me happy? Okay, and the things out there in the environment are available to me instrumentally. That is, my use of them, or my kind of use of the larger environment, is something that might make me happy. Okay, and so that's kind of what they mean by this separation between subject and object. That is, there's a subject who acts, who has will. There's a set of objects out there that are merely being described, observed, extracted by the willing subject. Okay, and in this vision, like according to the deep ecologists, that's part of what you're doing, is not just separating, but it's also establishing a hierarchy, right? Humans are on top of the hierarchy, everything else is at the bottom of the hierarchy. And like a bunch of the link and impact arguments from this perspective probably sound at least somewhat familiar to you, right? The like reliance on technological innovations or technological solutions, the notion of kind of hidden environmental costs, the presumption that what we're really doing in protecting resources is figuring out ways to kind of ensure that we can continue using them without making major changes to the way that we use them or why we use them, right? And a bunch of these arguments are also the ways in which the kind of ethical framework of deep ecology would be used as a frame. Like, do you see how each of the arguments that was made there are kind of the setup for a framework argument about ontology. So like, what is the world? Are we embedded in that world, or is there a strong separation between subject and object? An epistemic objection: is there a way for the subject to act as a knower of the objective world out there? So the kind of criticism of the Enlightenment sovereign self is also a criticism of a number of the epistemologies that come out of the Enlightenment. So a number of the kind of scientific claims about the strong separation between knower and known, or fact and value, right? That those show up all over the place when you're talking about some of the economic reasons that we might offer for, use in management, some of the geopolitical reasons that might be offered, that the kind of social sciences and natural sciences, as they're built, there are epistemic objections to those because they rely on that separation between subject and object. And then there's an ethical argument that's built in there as well, that is, we should change what it is that matters to us, the kind of who counts and what counts argument that I mentioned at the top, right? So if you think about it, like, that's a very quick run through, but just like each of those components is present in some of the framework arguments that deep ecology might make about how we should evaluate a debate and what is important to evaluate that in that debate, right? For instance, like, we shouldn't plan focus would say, what are the consequences of this particular environmental regulation? Deep ecology says, if what we're really debating is should we be deep ecologists or shallow ecologists, then what matters is not, can we kind of trace the individual effects of that particular regulation, but instead we have to ask a set of kind of more foundational questions about, does this serve the ethical ends that we want? Is this grounded in a way of knowing the world that is appropriate? And does this accurately reflect what the world is? So if the debate is, should we be shallow ecologists or deep ecologists, the fact that the plan is an example of shallow ecology is what matters, not the specific outcomes of the kind of that specific instance of shallow ecology. Okay. Eco-feminist perspectives, right? They generally share deep ecology's criticism of reason or utility as the basis for human environmental relationships. Many eco-feminists criticize what they perceive as deep ecologists' kind of masculinist commitment to heroic individual action, or some of the kind of misanthropic statements from deep ecologists about human dieback, or kind of some of the pseudo Malthusian stuff that's in there. Eco-feminist criticisms of modernist rationality kind of emphasize the way in which that what is treated as a subject-object distinction in deep ecology is influenced heavily by systems of gender hierarchy, right? And so rationality is associated with masculine values of control, independence, sovereignty, emotional detachment, right? So like, one of the flaws in the rationalist approach from the eco-feminist perspective is that it loses the capacity of reflexivity. It can't be rational about its commitment to certain elements of rationalism, okay? And if you think about kind of sample cards that would be read for the framework argument in these style of positions, I want to share an example from Val Plumwood. Can people read that? Give me a thumbs up if you can read that Plumwood card. Yeah, okay. So, right, the role of the dominant narrative of reason in framing the crisis is rarely able to emerge clearly because it is so pervasive, as much taken for granted as part of the framework of our thought as the air we breathe, right? According to the naturalistic version of the dominant narrative, the blame for our plight should be allocated to symbolically female nature side of the hyper-separated and warring pair, reason versus nature. It is nature, perhaps our natural human selfishness, which has led us astray. Reason intensified will be our hero and savior in the form of science, new technology, a more unconstrained market, rational restraints on consumption, or all of these together. While we remain trapped within this dominant narrative of heroic reason mastering blind nature, there is little hope for us. The narrative itself and its characters are a key part of the problem, leading us to reproduce the same elements of failure, including ecological blindness, even while we seek solutions. The technical fix plays the hero in alternative rationalistic scenarios. All will be well if the edicts of the market are applied in even more severity. A prioritized and increasingly disembedded global market is rapidly stripping away any social or ecological embeddedness. It negates the need for systematic action or deeper rethinking, relying on natural capitalism to save us simply delays addressing the basic problems, which are not primarily technological, but social, political, and cultural / symbolic. Okay, so that's like, I see that as, right, that's a framework card that would be extremely likely to be read in a debate that you're having about ecofeminism. And you see how it's like that framework argument, it applies that same kind of, like, it has an ontological argument, an epistemic argument, and an ethics argument. It is, that card's very useful in that it makes all of those very quickly. It, doesn't expand that much on any one of them, but you could easily see that being read as like plan focus is wrong because we need to approach the very framework of our thought, not the application of that thought in particular ways. Okay. And that kind of gets us out of that mode of plan focus. It also means that competition works differently, right? You could also see that card being read on a permutation that says, well, even if some aspects of the the plan, let's say, for example, the plan isn't a market-based mechanism the way that she's discussing in some of that card, right? It's like, oh, this is regulatory, not market-based. We kind of turn some of the elements of your initial link argument. You could see a card like that being read to say, well, we need to consider more than just the plan. We need to think about the justifications that are being presented for the plan. Like, what is the value framework that is found in the affirmative advocacy? And that the competition that changes there is we're not just evaluating, can the plan be combined with some aspects of the kind of framework that we're providing, but did the reasons given in the 1AC, did the picture of the world, that kind of rational division between subject and object, etc., like, what role do those play in making our decision, right? And it's like they need to play a large role because they are in part responsible for a number of the problems that we have, not just the kind of specific regulation or specific protection. Okay. So that's kind of the example of what's the neg getting out of getting out of some of these arguments in applying them to framework debates. I want to think about like what responding to these arguments substantively requires of the affirmative then. And I think that pragmatism provides one of the avenues that's pretty useful in responding to these arguments. So pragmatism, you are likely used to thinking about pragmatism as kind of like, to be pragmatic means to be practical, right? You may not be familiar with the terminology of pragmatism as a philosophy, right? So it's not like, one thing that I want to stress here is the pragmatists who are writing the set of cards that we're going to read don't conceive of pragmatism just as like, oh, you're being practical. They do think that practicality has a large role to play in answering some of those ontological and epistemic questions, but it isn't just, oh, I'm being pragmatic and I'm compromising. Like there's added depth to this. And in responding to these ecologically oriented Ks, right, we need to think about kind of conventional valuation of who counts and why, right? So like many of the advantage arguments may be couched in anthropocentric terms, right? So like, what do you do in responding to the ethical challenges to anthropocentrism? Okay. And then kind of, is what matters the kind of this, our thinking, our representation of the world, the variety of terms that we use in a number of these Ks for establishing kind of like the root cause style arguments, or we need to, that like shallow deep divide, right? You want an argument that kind of answers that question of what is the real problem here? Is the problem the specific case, or is the problem the larger mode of thought? And what is the relationship between those two? So we want an argument that answers or provides answers to different parts of that question or those questions. Environmental pragmatism, right, is pretty good at combining the practical demands of environmental strategy and advocacy with the philosophical defense of pluralism. So in that like pluralist versus monist debate above, pragmatists are strongly aligned on the pluralist side, okay? And part of the reason for that is pragmatism as a philosophy says that we are we should think of ourselves as living not in a universe, but in a pluriverse. Okay, so like think of universal, pluriversal. That is, there are multiple perspectives. There is no way to provide one unitary or universal perspective on the world around us. One of the basic features of that is, one, it is too complex to do so. So any perspective on part of that world will intrinsically be limited because it is not possible to know all things at all times. Okay, so that's kind of a core perspective in pragmatism. There is like, we cannot achieve universal and complete claims. There is always an aspect of incompleteness to all knowledge about the world. That's an epistemic argument, right? So like, pragmatism has a strong respect for the limits of our the limits of our being epistemically. No one can know all things. We can never know anything in its entirety. That is, the world is dynamic. It is so complex, and by its very nature contains a variety of these kind of different perspectives or different activities. It can't be reduced to one set of conclusions or one model. Okay, and that argument turns into potentially an offensive argument about trying to establish what is the kind of universal, either ontological or epistemic basis for how to relate to the world around us. The commitment to pluralism here isn't just, well, it's not possible to do that. It's also not desirable, because to presume that we could arrive at a universal or complete claim about the world around us is likely to impose inaccurately one model or understanding of that world on all possible activities in the world, right? It will assume that we live in a universe, not a pluriverse. So we need epistemic concepts that are adaptable rather than complete or total. Okay, and this is part of the argument here, is that pragmatism is an anti-foundationalist philosophy. That is, rather than seeking some kind of foundations in either ontological or epistemic claims about the world, because our epistemology is always limited, that we will never have complete access to the truth, capital T. That means that there is no way to reach an accurate ontological foundation about the kind of totality of what our world is. We can make potentially better and better, we can test better and better descriptions, like by acting in the world, we can test whether or not we are successful. Like the world pushes back on all of our actions, and so we can examine whether or not the actions produce the results that we wanted. But we're never going to know in its entirety or entirely in advance what some of those consequences of our actions will be. Okay, so the epistemic claim about the way in which all knowledge is provisional, that is little t truth instead of big T truth, like final truth, right? That epistemic kind of moderation is also an argument in favor of not attempting to establish complete ontological foundations as a prerequisite for any of our activities. Okay, and hopefully the way that I've started to phrase that argument gives you some sense of why this is a substantive response to many frameworks that say we must find the proper ontological kind of status of the world in order to then make any decision about it, right? Or we must apply the correct epistemology, like here is the way that the world can be known. Only if we know the world in this way can we then act ethically in it, right? All of those arguments that are set up as kind of like K prior type arguments on framework, this is the only thing that matters. Pragmatism provides a philosophical vocabulary for saying we should not treat those things as prior requirements, because it is impossible to arrive a priori at a complete conclusion about the ontological status of the world. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I share the wrong? I just saw Kevin's comment about sharing the wrong doc. Did I mess that up? That Plumwood card? No. Did people read that Plumwood card? Kevin, sorry. Give me an update there.
Well, I think it was just your notes. I couldn't find the.
Oh, I wish. Okay. Well, I guess then that's a theoretical benefit to me reading that card out loud. Oh well. I want to show, this time I will try and actually show the cards rather than my notes. We'll see if I can manage that. Nice job by me. What are we looking at now? Are we looking at my notes still, or are we looking at cards?
The card.
Okay, great. Now I just need to look at the card. Okay, here's a pragmatism card that outlines a number of the claims that I was just trying to describe about the kind of, do we want to establish prerequisites in thinking about our environmental policies? Okay. The pragmatist ought to have a long-term end in view, while at the same time she must have a readily visible alternatives which assume current political or economic systems and structures whenever possible. Not to say the pragmatic philosopher gives up on the tasks of defending alternatives to current structures. Our position may require we not rely exclusively on such changes in articulating our preferred ends for better public policies. A pragmatic philosophy, in the end, is in the service of an argument to create better policies. It must be prepared to argue its case before the public and policymakers. The public intellectual not only wants to express her beliefs, but also wants to persuade others. The pragmatic philosopher is interested in appealing to policymakers. Such a task requires attention to the question of what motivates either the public or policymakers. We must embrace a theoretical pluralism, which allows us to pick and choose from a range of conceptual frameworks in making our arguments without committing to the theoretical monism, which may be assumed in some version of these frameworks. Frameworks can change from audience to audience. If we think a utilitarian audience argument will be useful for talking to economists and decisions making positions, we should be allowed to engage such a framework without completely committing ourselves to utilitarianism. I hope that it is evident that this provides a theoretical vocabulary, and my guess is that most of you are accustomed to kind of, in giving your K2AC, your K2ARs, or 1ARs and 2ARs, that there isn't a lot of evidence to rely on to make some of the arguments that one would want to say for kind of case outweighs the root cause style arguments, or all that matters is the correct ontological stance in the world with the Heidegger K, right? Or some of these epistemic arguments about, can we know the world via some of our means of the natural and social sciences? Do you see how that language of conceptual pluralism makes some of the arguments for we ought to be evaluating the kind of policy in terms of its specific outcomes, rather than evaluating the conceptual framework as somehow prior to or more important than that outcome, right? So in the pluralism versus monism arguments, all of those pluralism arguments are answers to, we must establish a prior singular framework in order to make the appropriate decision, and instead makes the claim that frameworks are the things that ought to be most flexible. They should be the most elastic. We should pick and choose based on the ability to persuade. We should pick and choose based on the fact that we have limited knowledge about the situation around us, right? And that is in part the argument that says, here is a reason to evaluate the debate based primarily on the specifics of the case, rather than placing the case primarily as an example of a particular outmoded conceptual framework, like what you're doing with deep ecology, shallow ecology, or ecofeminism, or some of the managerialism arguments. Some of the Heideggerian arguments rely on similar premises. Okay, and not only does it give you some of that language about kind of whether or not the framework for the debate ought to be those kind of, quote, prior concerns, I think that there's also, built into that, at the top of that evidence, right, the kind of, whenever possible, we should assume some of the existing institutions and compare alternatives based on the viability of changing those institutions. Do you see how that's an argument that then says the choice of conceptual framework shouldn't be an a priori issue, in part because the changes that we could make, if we could make changes to some of those overall conceptual frameworks or like ethical presuppositions in making these decisions, it's not that, it's like that card says, it's not that we should give up on that task, but we should assess realistically whether or not that is the thing that can be done in this situation. So it gives you the argument about kind of why evaluate the AF in comparison to the status quo that was staked out in the 1AC, instead of versus an alternative that is so different from the status quo that it's something that's entirely different than the society in which we live, right? That a society that was organized along deep ecological lines, that alternative success is something that shouldn't be assumed in this comparison, because it is so different that if that is the type of change that could be made, then we would be making a number of different specific policy proposals. But given the set of institutions and the situations that we have, this is another way of saying uniqueness should matter, right? It's like that we should be approaching something on the basis of the situation as presented to us in the present, instead of versus all possible different, kind of worldviews or conceptual frameworks that could be used to make a decision about what to do. Okay. And it gives you the ability to apply that based on, kind of a card and a substantive response to the argument, again, as opposed to saying alternatives are unfair, right? Alternatives are unfair. Pretty worried about the ability to win that argument in front of most of the contemporary judging pool. To give some depth to that argument about what to compare to and why, I want to give another example card that we're going to talk through. It's a little longer. Okay. A little longer, and I want to talk about it introduces, for sometimes I think also what we're missing in some of the affirmative sides of these debates, kind of stories or analogies that give us a way to explain how and why to make decisions in a particular way. This is Brian Norton, who's a pragmatist who writes a lot about sustainability. He's got a much larger kind of tome on sustainability if somebody wants to take that up. It's got an interesting set of cards that would be, I think, potentially useful for some of these like resource-based arguments. But here he's discussing kind of the relationship between ethics and epistemology in pragmatist philosophy. Okay, so improving our knowledge is like repairing a ship, and he's borrowing this from, there's a sociologist, either German or Austrian, Otto Neurath, wrote mostly in the 30s and 40s, but he's using an analogy or this image from Neurath. Improving our knowledge is like repairing a ship while on the seas. As particular planks weaken, we replace them, standing on the strongest remaining planks while replacing the weakest ones. The pursuit of epistemological renewal for the pragmatists, unlike Descartes, does not start by tearing down every plank of knowledge, necessitating a completely new construction. Rather, by identifying the most problematic planks of knowledge, we must keep the boat afloat as we do our repairs. Okay, couple things to note here. The unlike Descartes part, which I did not underline here, why is Descartes being referenced here? Anybody know kind of the most famous phrase associated with Descartes and Cartesian thinking?
Is that I think, therefore I am?
Yeah, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. When people refer to the Cartesian subject, Descartes starts with complete suspension or doubt about all possible things except what's the one thing that you can be absolutely sure of? It is that in the activity of thinking, I am thinking. I think, therefore I am. So everything else we can be entirely skeptical about whether or not we have foundations for knowing any other part of our world, but we know that we think. Therefore, I think, therefore I am. Okay, that's the Cartesian cogito. Where do we think, why do I think that something that is responding to this Cartesian demand, okay, helps us against some of these other critical cards that we already introduced? I know now I feel extra bad that I didn't have that Plumwood card up on the actual screen, but was just reading it out loud. But when Plumwood talks about rationalism, okay, how many of you in some of those cards have seen reference to either Descartes, the sovereign subject, or Cartesian rationality, or rationality capital R? Give me a thumbs up if that's something that has shown up in a number of these cards that you've been reading through as you've been reading the generics, or that you've seen in some other kind of earlier K debates. Does that ring a bell? I also realize that as I'm screen sharing, I can only see the visual ones, not the, yeah, okay, we got some raised hands. When Plumwood refers to that notion of a rationalistic framework in which reason, capital R, is separated from emotion, reason is the foundation for all knowledge, that's this Cartesian vision. reason capital R, okay? So not only is this pragmatism argument intended to say we are not deploying reason as a foundational concept, like this does not privilege reason capital R in the same way that it doesn't say that we can reach capital T truth, okay? It's provisional, right? There is a secondary argument here about the kind of what to do when faced with the fact that we have parts of our epistemology that appear like they are no longer satisfactory, right? This image of we have to replace them a plank at a time. We can't completely overhaul them all at once. That is, making epistemological shift or conceptual framework shifts into the goal for the debate is undesirable because we're on this ship at sea. We've got to make incremental changes to who we are and how we think. What, in debate terms, what is the ship? We're on the ship that's at sea already. What's the sea there? Give me the debate word for the sea. No suggestions?
Would it be like the plan, the resolution?
No, I don't think so. The plan is not the sea. It's like if our image for epistemology is it's like repairing a ship while we're at sea. So we need to change, we need to make some different epistemological commitments, but we can't change them all at once. So for instance, like think of this as even if we think that the epistemology that's found in some versions of mainstream economics, that there are epistemic assumptions that are not valid, okay? It is one thing to say we should throw out all economic thinking, and another thing to try and redesign an entire, all of our governmental institutions, media, education, etc., all of the things that circulate that type of thinking or that conceptual framework. Changing them all at once would be right. It's extremely difficult. We got to basically like dock the ship in order to, it's like we change, we got to switch ships. We got to change everything, tear it all down, build it, build up something new. So what's the C there?
Like knowledge or the world.
Okay, so knowledge of the world. What's the debate version of knowledge of the world in terms of an affirmative case? I'll provide my helping hand here. It's uniqueness. It's the status quo. It's where we are. Are we located in a situation like, you see how it's like any affirmative case that establishes kind of the uniqueness for its advantage is making an observation about the world as it is right now. What range of changes are likely to be available to us? The C is it's the situation, it's the case. What is the situation that we are in? Okay. That's why I was saying it's not the plan, right? We've got to make if the plan is the ship, right? It's like, where are we going? Where are we headed? Why do we want to go somewhere else? Okay. And the situation is the thing that we are evaluating. So we've got to make repairs incrementally, okay, rather than, well, we can start all over with an entirely new set of assumptions. The style of conceptual change that is posited by most alternative arguments that says all that matter, especially if the framework argument is none of the case matters because all that matters is making the kind of proper ontological assumption about what the world is, right? Or the proper epistemic assumptions about how we know that world. All of those arguments that are designed to say framework shrinks the set of impacts that the judge can or should consider, right? This is a way of saying that shrinking that down is inappropriate. We should not try and assume that we are capable of making wholesale conceptual changes. We should assume that incremental changes via practice, so testing, that's the practical part, is like the world is pluriversal as defined by our experience. We are constantly testing our assumptions about that world via action and activity. So that's the portion of kind of where practicality comes into pragmatism. Okay. The analogy, that is the analogy to a ship at sea, avoids a skeptical conclusion about knowledge because the decisions made do not escape the test of experience. That is, we're not totally skeptical about our ability to know any part of that world. We can test through experience. Staying afloat depends on realistic assessments of damage to the ship and realistic models of what will happen if a particular plank fails. That is, the incremental nature of change is also connected to our limited ability to observe the world as we think we can find it, right? The fact that we are also making provisional claims about that world, those claims ought to be more practicable and smaller when possible, rather than grandiose or universal. The progression of the scientific endeavor will bring larger and larger communities and their collective individual experiences into discourses about what to do to protect the environment. The key is we can adopt a position of limited realism by pushing the level at which we judge truth and falsity to the action level at which we act on our total belief system in particular situations. Definitely should underline that one. But, right, do you see how that's an argument for plan focus phrased substantively rather than theoretically, right? At the action level, we test the belief that we have rather than using the belief to test whether or not the action is appropriate. So the debate should not be, is this shallow or deep ecology, but is instead, when we test this activity, does it produce the ecological ends that we want? Direct experience can tell us that we have a leak in our system of knowledge. Limited realism accepts the fact that no substantive knowledge of the external world is knowable a priori. That is, we cannot know in advance of experience or in advance of testing how the world will respond. Realism must be limited. It contains a method of selection and is thus self-correcting on the basis of broader experience. One cannot believe anything one wishes and still survive. This is a necessity imposed on us by our environment. Adaptive managers can thus adopt limited realism as a working epistemology, as we learn new methods whereby proposals can be tested, avoiding the necessity of having a cultural collapse to disprove every errant hypothesis. The hope is represented in the emphasis that pragmatists place on devising techniques and methods to help winnow truth from falsehood without catastrophic cultural failure. That is, instead of the complete teardown and rebuild, right, or the like, this is at a level of cultural shift must be absolute. Instead, the kind of push in different directions, replace or repair one plank at a time. This is the substantive justification for an incremental style response to some of the problems that are posed at a conceptual level, like ontology or epistemology. Okay. And so, the way that I would deploy this set of cards is to give yourself a kind of avenue back into, instead of, when people make the framework argument that is like evaluate the plan versus the K, okay, or something like that, and try and give the theoretical argument about affirmative offense, the negative generally has good cards that they can read, like that Plumwood card that I was reading out loud, that sort of say, like, we need to think bigger about what it is that the affirmative is advocating. They're not advocating a particular plan. They are instead, kind of giving us a worldview that is implicit in the way they presented the case. We're going to criticize and bring out a bunch of those implicit assumptions. That's what the debate should be about, not the working within this set of assumptions or within this set of institutions, this is desirable. And so this set of arguments gives you the way to explain why we ought to make decisions primarily on the basis of what we think might be realistically movable, what might be persuasive to particular audiences, and that those conceptual frameworks aren't something that are tied intrinsically to each advocacy, but rather are tested through the application of the plan. So the obligation on any of these positions is to disprove the specifics of the case and the solvency arguments, rather than to disprove conceptually, for instance, like, is it desirable that we would consider this aspect of water policy to be a resource when trying to protect it? Okay. Like, we don't need complete conceptual or framework style agreement, because the world is complicated enough to demand theoretical pluralism and limited or incremental changes, given the inability to generally kind of tear down our society from the very roots to build something that is entirely different. So it gives you the substantive responses that I think most people are trying to pursue theoretically without evidence, So, it gives you kind of that, like, it gives you the ability to rely on and to use explanation that comes from evidence, as opposed to this is unfair to the AF. It gives you the kind of background for why it is we should make decisions in this way. So I wanted to wrap up there to give 10 minutes or so for Q&A, maybe a little bit more time as well, as if we kind of head into the lunch period, but kind of curious what people's reactions are, if there are additional things that I could clarify here. Yeah, Nathan.
I was wondering if you think this kind of pragmatism or pluralism framework can be applied to like a perm, or to justify considering like, the realism of the plan combined with like maybe like a perm that's like endorse like the realism of the plan, so like keep the ship afloat while still like endorsing a slight, like maybe replace a few planks or like a slight shift. It could work as a permutation.
Yes. So that kind of like, we don't need one conceptual framework. We should pick and choose the set of justifications that are presented based on different audiences. Like, all of that stuff is designed basically to say, for one, it gives you potentially the substantive argument for don't treat competition at the level of conceptual framework, treat it at the level of proposal, right? So like, it gives you kind of that like substantive argument for permutations should remain more in the realm of comparing the plan's compatibility with parts of the alternative, as opposed to the 1AC's compatibility with the alternative, right? So it gives you some avenue there. And then just one thing to quickly mention, because since you used that kind of quote about limited realism from the end of that Norton card, I want to be clear that that limited realism refers to, it's an epistemic position. It's not realism like, realism as a theory of international relations or something like that. It's just like realism is being used there in the epistemic sense of like, do we want a realistic or an idealistic kind of assumption about philosophy? It's a philosophical debate there, not one about international relations, right? It's like, it's not making an argument about realism in that sense. So just wanted to clarify that, since you brought up that terminology. But yes, I think that is right. Like, since part of what's happening here is there may be a substantive argument for kind of either plan focus or evaluate the specifics of the case before these kind of grand ethical or conceptual questions about ontology, right? That would apply potentially as well to models of competition, to say competition ought to be evaluated at the level of the plan or the proposal rather than the conceptual framework. What else? We feel totally great about all of our framework debates, and we've got all the cards we need. Got it.
In a real debate, would we still try to implement these arguments on the like specific framework portion of the debate? And if so, what interpretation should we use? Or should it just be like reasons for why the permutation is better or why the alternative fails?
Yeah, I think that it could be used in any of those ways. And I would make the adjustment based in part on how the negative explains their argument, right? So the more expansive the negative framework claim, the more that these can be explained as offensive arguments against prioritizing ontology or prioritizing epistemology, right? Do you see how it's like, then what you're getting into is kind of, you mentioned that combination with the difficulty of explaining the alternative arguments. Alternative arguments, as the link gets bigger, right? So like, or more foundational. So for instance, like the state or the law is intrinsically anti-ecological, right? Or anyone treating water as a resource is a reason to throw out any, kind of any of those proposals that are grounded in that vision of the world. They can't even be considered, right? It is inappropriate ontologically to regard water as a resource. Think about when those framework arguments are being made as impact arguments, we should only consider, like, essentially, as soon as water is regarded as a resource, it entails all of these consequences. That is all that can be evaluated. That also makes the alternative explanation much more difficult from this perspective, because it says, well, is there a proposal that will get us, our society, to not treat water as a resource? Is there a way to tear down that ship entirely before we build a new one, right? And so that's where I think that you want to get into some of the arguments about whether or not there is a way to make some of these alternatives succeed persuasively, politically, right? Like, can we get people to stop treating water purely as a resource rather than ought it be treated purely as a resource, right? So you could make the argument, you could switch it primarily to, you know, their framework arguments all depend on the idea that what we are evaluating is alternatives in the abstract rather than to the specific situation. Even if they win their framework arguments, those all presume basically that what we are doing is comparing to a completely new and different alternative worldview. Such a option is not possible. Here's why: we are unlikely to be able to persuade people to adopt those assumptions. So that framework is actually part of why this alternative is unlikely to succeed, right? One of the big strategic advantages that the negative has in a lot of critique debates, or just like one of the things that makes them very difficult, is all of the arguments are linked together, right? Like, we break them into different pieces to help explain different parts of them. But by and large, like, it's not like when you're debating a DA with, uniqueness, link, and impact, each of those sections, because it's a causal chain and like an observation about the world and then a chain of effects that flow from that observation of the world, you can break it apart analytically very easily as like each of these portions is distinct, right? Most critiques do not have the ability to be broken apart entirely analytically in that way, right? The link arguments are not causes in a causal chain. They're examples of assumptions or values that are being criticized, right? So it's not the plan causes capitalism. It is, here are the assumptions that are found in designing a capitalist economy that show up in this 1AC, right? And that means that, like, the tool that is often used on the neg is winning one portion of the debate can be translated into winning all of the others. Because we won framework, we don't need to win solvency for the alternative. Because we won, any degree of link argument, because our framework is phrased in terms of like, all that matters is to evaluate the whether or not, this is an ethical stance against settler colonialism, or, is this an imposition of gendered violence via the imposition of rationality, right? Those arguments are always linked together in a way that the neg can kind of pick and choose, because each one of the areas of argument gives you a way to explain all of the others. It is rare that I think we see people successfully deploy that in the reverse on the AF, where it's like, well, the only reason that the framework arguments appear so absolute or clear cut is because there is an assumption that we can build alternatives, that are entirely new. If we can't, then this framework is inappropriate for the debate. Like, it might be desirable to completely revise our ontology or our epistemology, but because it is unlikely, because they have yet to provide an explanation for how we will go about doing that, this is an inappropriate way to make decisions, because we know that we can't get there, right? Yeah, we could only consider those impacts if it were possible to reach a society that had an entirely different set of ethical presuppositions. But given that we are unlikely to, then we should consider these impacts differently in terms of the specific situation that's been presented, specific solvency arguments, etc. Does that, I don't know if that quite answers your question, but do you see how it's like, you as the AF ought to be able to kind of pick and choose which version of that argument you're explaining based on, some combination of negative explanation and coverage. If the negative is making their framework argument much more just about like, it's not plan focus instead of it's only these things, right? Then I don't think that you would deploy that argument nearly as much to kind of say like, we're going for offense against their framework. It's just then you might say, okay, if they win their argument that, the framework means we should consider a number of these other kind of issues of assumptions or values that are embedded in the 1AC, our permutation says you should be more flexible to pick and choose between those assumptions, as long as you could make a case for the plan from a variety of theoretical frameworks. The permutation is acceptable, because you should treat those justifications as specific to given audiences rather than some kind of grandiose statement about what the world is or how it works. So you've got a few different options about how and when to kind of follow through on these arguments, given that they are mostly interrelated. Does that clarify a little bit?
Yeah, it does. I also have I have another question. How do you explain why the plan or the assumptions in the 1AC are more realistic than the alternative?
Sure. I think that that's a place where I would begin to use some concrete examples about kind of environmental protection or environmental policy in the United States, economic policy in the United States, right? If you think about public opinion polling on, trying to communicate some very basic value assumptions, like we are very, very far from that. Many of these criticisms themselves conclude that our society is very, very far from a number of the kind of ethical frameworks that we need to use in order to reach a different form of environmental sustainability or a different relationship to the environment, right? So this is a more realistic situation, or this is a more realistic understanding of our situation, I think is I would just begin to use some examples about how hard it is to persuade people to adopt totally different ethical systems. Like, for the most part, communicating with people, like, it's difficult to get people to accept different conclusions even when we find some shared ground on like what our values ought to be, or some shared vocabulary about the importance of something like economic growth. It's really difficult to communicate and persuade even within that environment. Trying to persuade someone to totally change their fundamental beliefs or relationships about the world, that's real difficult. There is, the counter to this in a bunch of the negative arguments about kind of different ecological ethics or different green politics is, now the use of kind of existential risks that are posed by climate, resource use, etc. Some of those arguments and the time frame in which we need to change our society completely, like, those can be used as, it's like, it is you who is being unrealistic. Like, we only have 10 years to change entirely away from a capitalist growth driven economy or something like that. I think that that's a reason why, if that, it depends. Now we're talking about like these arguments, and their usefulness depends a lot on what style of affirmative you are reading, right? So let's say you were reading an AF that has a small version of some part of the scarcity advantage, or like the AT, like cost benefit analysis AF or something like that, right? The Ks that could be read that have link arguments to, you're not completely overhauling everything, you're only making this incremental change. In those cases where the link arguments have to be so big, right, and kind of there is some common agreement about the environment advantage, that's a place where I think these arguments are most likely to be effective. If you're reading the nuclear desalination AF, I don't think is an amazing example of kind of, we're going to debate them on the pragmatist, aspects of environmental protection, because that case isn't really about the environment, right? So it's kind of like, this is really a set of arguments that are designed around what happens when you've got a case, or like the ICBMs AF, right? Like, I just don't, there you're not really reading an environmental affirmative for the most part, and so some of the environmental pragmatism arguments line up less well. But if you are reading some of these arguments that are about environmental protection, and the negative advantage there in some ways is like, they do have great impact cards about where our society is headed. Just like, you've agreed with them that aspects of our society are environmentally very dangerous, right? This is why, in reading one of those style of AFs on this topic, I would actually not make this is now totally idiosyncratic. Like, very few other people I think would agree with me on this, but like, that's a reason that I would not read an existential level risk argument about your environment advantage, because I would want to set up the realism limited incremental stuff based on a harm that is incremental rather than existential, right? So like, improving water quality from like the ag runoff, or like, we shouldn't deploy ag exceptionalism, or some of those arguments about environmental protection, then you're dealing with something where the specific you're in a much better position to make the argument that specifics matter, right? Versus if you're reading the like, well, say the the other ATF on cloud seeding, right? On like, here's this, experimental kind of set of technologies and models for the climate that, then we read the like solar radiation management key to prevent climate extinction. Like, suddenly those negative arguments that say you're being unrealistic because you're posing these things in terms of kind of these, miracle style technologies rather than addressing some of the core social and ecological assumptions that we find in our society. I like where the neg is on that a little bit better than if you're reading the smaller version of that, but maybe that's just me. Like, everybody's used to making a bunch of their AFK impact arguments about existential risk. I really don't think that versus the ecology oriented Ks that existential risk is the way to go. There are much more arguments about kind of time frame or the probability of resolving this particular environmental harm and not holding us responsible for all of the environmental harms that are being caused by some of these other kind of conceptual or framework presumptions about environmental management. Happy to take a couple more questions, or if people want to head to their lunch break, that's also okay at this point.
Oh, I wanted to also ask, do you think you could weigh this pragmatism? You could like go for this argument or like read it against a critical affirmative as like defense or even offense?
Yes and no. Some of the because of the pluralism style arguments, I think it is more difficult to explain it as offensive arguments versus the like, you chose this, like these pragmatism cards are not great at, because they're not designed to say like, it is really bad to talk about the land ethic, right? Or like, we should not consider issues of settler colonialism because it, you know what I mean? Like, it is generally has been used on the AF in part because it fits much more easily with the language of permutation. Now, if there are some areas where like you could, it is possible, I think, to write a negative strategy that kind of takes as its alternative what conventionally would be explained as a permutation and sort of starts with that as the alternative explanation, like, don't prioritize one method, or don't, like places where some of the critical affirmatives use absolutist language to set up a critique of T. That might be the place where I would read a limited link argument about the importance of theoretical pluralism. And then there are some arguments there about that as kind of, this is important for public persuasion to avoid complete backlash. Like, there are arguments that you could read about, like, don't start from the requirement that like we must only think of the world in this way type stuff. That those alternatives can be tricky to explain because like, why can't the AF permute them? I think there are reasons that the AF can't permute them if they're using some of the really absolutist language about like the first, the only, must own, like you look for those kind of places where the AF is deploying very exclusive terminology. And then arguably it does make some of the pluralistic arguments competitive, right? The like, well, this should be one ethical concern among others, not the only ethical framework that we ought to use. And here's why. And it's like, but it's the way that that takes a lot of pretty sophisticated writing of both link and impact arguments. I don't think you're going to be great dumping a bunch of these cards on the case as like, small incremental changes are, like better than wholesale change. Like, I don't think they work very well as an offensive argument without a much larger kind of setup for, here's the place where we are competing with their kind of monism, right? The like, we're taking the pluralism side of the debate. They committed to monism here, here, and here kind of thing. But yeah, it can be done. Other questions, or shall we wrap up?
I was just curious about like whether Norton and Plumwood and the cards that you showed us and their authors, these are the only views that like directly clash against each other. Like, are there other reasons for each perspective that can be useful against both of these arguments?
Oh yeah, no, I mean, I like to get really good at this set of arguments, you should go read a lot. You know, I'm trying to give kind of the limited sample as a way of here's a couple pieces that I think use language that is useful given the way that people talk about these arguments in debate. But I mean, there's a lot to be read about this stuff out there, and like I think that becoming more familiar with the vocabulary and the terms of debate, I mean, that's something that will help you make the arguments a lot better. I'm not suggesting that these are kind of the only aspects of these philosophies that clash, but I wanted to focus on ones that were kind of particularly relevant to some of these debates about frameworks.
Mm-hmm. Wait, do you have any recommendations for what other like literatures we can read?
I mean, if you plug a bunch of these people into like kind of cited by scholar searches, you'll get quickly into a more expansive debate about environmental ethics. So like, you know, Brian Norton, if you look at on the monist side, there's like Baird Caldecott is a kind of prominent monist on the Leopoldian land ethic. Andrew Light, that one of the people that I showed in one of those cards is written, like they all cite each other. You would pretty quickly get into a, like, if I track down a bunch of the footnotes or cited by for some of these different works, then you'll get into there pretty quickly. Because it is, especially the kind of academic side of pragmatism, you know, it's a lot of interlinked kind of journal articles and books. So you know, or like Brian Norton's, like I said, he's got a tome on sustainability, and you know, I don't remember the cited by numbers in Scholar for that book, but I'm pretty sure they're real high. And you know, you do search within cited by there for like pragmatism, pluralism, monism, you're going to get some of these kind of similar articles or pieces that are designed around similar concerns. Okay, I think we'll wrap up for lunch. Hope everybody enjoys lab this afternoon. I know some of you have debates. Good luck with those. And yeah, thanks for some good questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.